Welcome to the Requel Podcast. I am Tyler, and in this podcast, we take a property and I basically pitch you my idea if I had keys to the kingdom and what I would do with it. And this one, I'm thinking, and this will be fun. Anyone knows me. I'm a DC fan. Comics wise, I host the Krypton Report podcast, a all Superman based podcast with DC conversations in there. And I pitched a few DC based properties before. But this one I got thinking about, and here we go. We're just going to Superboy. All right. So first of all, yes, there was a Superboy series in the late 80s, early 90s, but let's be honest, he was an adult. They just had to use the name Superboy because they didn't have the rights to use the name Superman at the time. Uh, and he was in college. Okay, that's not really Superboy. Then there was Smallville, which was a take, no flights, no tights, and he was doing all the things without a suit, and then later the jacket, blah, 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 blah. But he was an adult, okay? But my take is recently listening to my friend Anthony Desiato for Dating for Kryptonite interviewed Mark Waid, and Mark Waid is bringing Superboy, like young Clark Kent, Superboy, back into the comics. And as of this recording, the first issue is out in Action Comics. And I got thinking about it. And of course, there's the old Superboy pilot that's fun to watch. It's on YouTube, or was on YouTube, starring John Rockwell. And he's like in high school. But I started thinking about Solomon. He's 10 now, and what that looks like. And I got thinking about shows that have been kind of rebooted. We have the Percy Jackson series on Disney Plus, where they're more age-appropriate children than, young adults or older teenagers trying to play younger. And then they're rebooting Harry Potter on HBO for a series. And I got thinking about, what if we did Superboy, but he's in middle school? So he really is a boy. And we make it this more fun, family-oriented show about a kid who's, coming into being a teenager. He's 10, 11, 12, 13, that age bracket, because I've learned that some schools start middle school at, 5th grade now. It's 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. And I got thinking, well, it would be really interesting um, to do Superboy this way. So where Clark, starts developing his powers. And it's half-hour shows. And he's on the farm. And, there's a flavor of Smallville in there, yes. But it's more about this kid going on these adventures and things that that he doesn't understand the weight and what he's really doing. And there's a fun element to it, not so much a melodrama. I think it would be cool to incorporate the idea if he starts out with a very grassroots costume, kind of similar to the New 52 with the t-shirt and the cape and the jeans, but then kind of how John Kent, his son, started out with kind of a hoodie type thing and ripped jeans and Converse. Like, he starts out slowly building a costume until he gets the full-on, costume. And there's some tweaks that can be made so it's a little bit different than what will be the Superman suit. And he's developing and learning his identity. I mean, for Superman fans, we always say, oh, that's Smallville. Smallville's been over for 10 plus years. It ended in 2011. Okay. It ended the year I got married. So it's been done for 14 years. We just had Superman and Lois, and they had the young Superboys type thing. But they're teenagers again. But I think a Superman based series, and you could even put in, if you wanted to tie it to like the adventures of like young Clark of James Gunn's Superman, you could do that. Or if you want to make it its own thing, there's that too. You could add in crypto if you wanted to, or if not, and I think it would be fun to have just this adventures of this boy, and not leaning heavily on the Superman mythology. Currently, I'm watching The Adventures of Superman starring George Reeves, and he doesn't ever really fight any supervillains. It's thugs and crooks and con men and gangsters and that type of thing. Those are the villains and people that he takes down. Very much that champion of the oppressed. And if you go back and you do Superboy, but you sprinkle in some of that golden age Superman where he's not as powerful. Superboy, he doesn't fly just yet. We build up his powers. And you have a kid who's learning this, who's now stopping adults. And is he doing what's right? But he makes mistakes. And I think that's one of the big pluses with doing Superboy is he makes mistakes. He can screw up. He doesn't have to be perfect. He leans into his parents. Um, and like I said, it's not a rehash of Smallville, but the themes are there. Um, but I think really playing to the younger audience, the younger demographic. Like I said, looking at the Percy Jackson show. And you have Pete and Lana and One Day to Be Conduit, But you don't play up like in Smallville. You had the Meteor Rocks and the Meteor Freaks of the Week, but we don't play up that as much. Like you have people that come into Smallville, but you also have him going out of Smallville. And I think one thing that would be interesting is over time in this series, Superman and Lois ended where Clark Kent revealed himself to the world, which that was their choice. But what I preferred and what I liked is the idea that Smallville discovers who Superman is, but it's their big town secret. So you kind of build up this idea that Smallville starts to figure it out over time and know that Superboy is Clark, but nobody says anything. That's their town secret. That's something they keep hidden. I just like the idea of seeing a 10 to 12-year-old kicking butt, saving people, and, going outside and playing ball, playing with his friends, but then still having that weight of coming into your own. So much of it, these coming of age stories are I'm a teenager to an adult, but what about a child to a teenager? I think some of the most important beats would be how you set up your characters. For example, Lana would live with her parents in Smallville, in the town, and run a small business. And there was times in the Superboy comics where the Kents ran a general store, and maybe Martha has a small business that she runs in town while Jonathan manages the farm, and they sell a lot of their farm stuff out of the small business, kind of like a farmer's market ongoing type thing. I don't know. Also, I think you start off with Pete, and much like they kind of did on Man of Steel, you start off a Pete and Clark kind of frenemy, a little bit of rivalry. Pete's not always the nicest to Clark, but then what you do is you see Pete's the first one to learn his secret, and because of Clark's goodness and example, changes Pete, and they become the best of friends, and Pete becomes a better person than where he could have been, you know. I wouldn't go for the classic broken home, tropes. But Pete's just a little bit of a rough kid that comes around and becomes the lovable Pete that we all know and love. But he's always been made to feel like he needs to not be that person. But being friends with Clark has made him realize he can be himself. And we see that friendship grow and that strength grow. Um, but so often do we, I'm looking at Pete, Clark, and Lana as like a Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Go back and watch the first two Harry Potter movies. And that's kind of what I'm thinking. Like, that's exciting for kids to kind of see themselves as these protagonists with powers and abilities. So often do we just kind of shape for the adults. One of the big things about Spider-Man was he was always in high school. And the most recent Spider-Man cartoon was really, really well done. Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. He's in high school, but he definitely feels like a young kid. And I think too often we try to portray kids as being older than what they are. And it's okay to portray them as kids. Clark in his room reading, Clark playing with, some toys, some Legos, Clark, um, playing sports too, like trying to, like that awkward growing up phase. I think these are the things that are important to create value and to make a role model show for kids. So that's my Superboy pitch. Could be fun. Um, I think the other things, if you want to do Superboy as a spin-off of a Superman property, but I think that time has passed, really. I think with what they're doing over in DC Studios and everything is they're slimming things down so that we're not having Superman pop up. Oh, hey, here's a stunt casting on Titans. Here is a Superman on Supergirl. Here's a Superman stunt on Naomi. Here is now Superman on his own show with Superman and Lois. Oh, we're just kind of throwing this out there. I think we've kind of funneled it down a little bit more so the stories can be tighter and interconnected. So I don't think a spinoff about like a young John Kent would work. As much as I'd love to see something based off the Super Sons, that was one of my favorite DC animated films recently. But Superboy, what were your thoughts? Let me know in the comments.